for every Israeli killed, 100 Palestinians were killed. For every Israeli civilian killed, about 400 Palestinian civilians were killed. That's plainly not a war. That's a massacre. The topic for my remarks this evening is what happened in Gaza a year and a half ago, about a year and a half ago now. And that in itself is a kind of curiosity, because as everybody in this room knows, wars come and go with great frequency and rapidity in the Middle East, and barely a few months elapse before they disappear from the public consciousness. And yet something peculiar happened with Gaza, because it's nearly a year and a half since the Israeli invasion of Gaza, and yet it remains as current as ever. In fact, it almost seems as if it happened at most a month or two ago. And so one of the questions which is worth trying to ponder this evening is, why does Gaza endure? Why is it this ghost, Gaza, that try as Israel does, it can't seem to bury? Why is it that this shadow follows Israel wherever it goes? As Professor Ghanem said in his introductory remarks, even now, a year and a half later, Israeli officials feel very insecure because wherever airport they depart from, they're fearful that papers will be served, and the papers will be served because of what they did in Gaza. And so, why is that? Why does Gaza live so long after what Israel inflicted during those 22 days that Amnesty International called the 22 days of death and destruction? I want to begin, however, with some of the background to how we got to those 22 days. It's always a little bit arbitrary. Where do you begin? The Goldstone report, to which I'll return later, it more or less begins with the ceasefire that Israel signed with Hamas in June 2008. I will go a little bit further back. In January 2006, there were parliamentary elections in the occupied Palestinian territories, and Hamas, the Islamic movement, emerged victorious. The elections, according to the former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who was one of the international observers, he said the elections were completely honest and fair. In reaction to these completely honest and fair elections, Israel, backed by the United States and then the European Union, it imposed economic sanctions on Hamas and on the Palestinian people living in Gaza. In June 2007, the United States, Israel, and some elements among the Palestinian Authority attempted a coup to overthrow the legally elected government. In the United States, that's called democracy promotion. Hamas foiled the coup, and it sent the Palestinian elements packing to the West Bank. In reaction to the foiled coup attempt, Israel, backed by the United States, it tightened the blockade on Gaza, a blockade which Amnesty International now called a flagrant violation of international law, a blockade which the Goldstone mission later called a possible crime against humanity. The former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, she journeyed to Gaza during these months, and she said, and now I'm quoting her, "Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. Its whole civilization has been destroyed." In June 2008, Israel and Hamas entered into a ceasefire that was brokered by the Egyptian government. And under the ceasefire, each side had obligations. On the Palestinian side, they were obliged to cease their rocket and mortar attacks on Israel. On the Israeli side, they were obliged to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza, the blockade which was a flagrant violation of international law, the blockade which was destroying a civilization. According to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now I'm quoting it, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. There were some, to use the Israeli terminology, rogue terrorist organizations, not Hamas, but using the Israeli terminology, rogue terrorist organizations which were not observing the ceasefire. According to the Israelis, and now I'm quoting them again, Hamas enforced the ceasefire on the rogue terrorist organizations with a great deal, although not complete success. So on one side, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Israel, however, reneged on its obligation to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza, the blockade which was a flagrant violation of international law. Well, what happened next? Here the evidence is perfectly clear. All one has to do is turn to the Amnesty International Yearbook for 2008. And Amnesty writes, "A ceasefire agreed in June between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza, it held for 4.5 months. But it broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on 4 November. The ceasefire was holding, even though Israel had reneged on its obligations. And then Israel patiently waited until Election Day in the United States, the historic election where the media and the public were riveted to the results. And on that day, Israel invaded Gaza, killed 6 Palestinian militants, knowing full well that at that point the ceasefire would break down, which is what happened. But you know those Islamicists, those fanatics and lunatics and cowards, you can never predict what they'll do next. And so what did Hamas do? Hamas kept saying, until the end of December, we're willing to renew the ceasefire. We're ready to renew the ceasefire. But Israel has to live up to its obligation. It has to lift the blockade which is a flagrant violation of international law. Israel said no. Hamas had to unconditionally and unilaterally cease its rocket attacks on Israel. By December, Sarah Roy of Harvard University, the world's leading authority on Gaza's economy, She also happens to be the daughter of survivors of Auschwitz concentration camp. Sarah Roy wrote, "The breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us. It's happening in front of us in Gaza. But there is little international response beyond UN warnings, which are ignored." And now the people of Gaza, Hamas, was confronted with two stark options. One, it could acquiesce, succumb to its gradual starvation. Or the second option was to resist. Hamas chose to resist, although the resistance was largely symbolic. The former Israeli commander in Gaza, his name is Shmuel Zakai, the former Israeli commander in Gaza, he said, speaking to the Israelis, "You cannot just land blows, leave the Palestinians in Gaza in the economic distress they're in, and expect that Hamas will just sit around and do nothing." In the midst of the invasion, the Hamas leader, Khalid Mashal, he said, "Our modest homemade rockets are our cry of protest to the world." Our modest homemade rockets are our cry of protest to the world. What were those rocket attacks, if not a message to an indifferent world? SOS, we're dying. SOS, we're dying. It's easy enough to condemn Hamas for the rocket attacks, but then, in my opinion, you have to show what was their other option. If you can't demonstrate that they had another option, but you're telling them to not fire the rockets, you're in effect saying that the people of Gaza had a legal and moral obligation to just lie still and die. In any event, on December 27th, 2008, Israel invaded Gaza, and 22 days later, the attack, or the formal attack, ended. What happened in Gaza during those 22 days? Nowadays, when you read reports on what happened in Gaza, even by sympathetic sources, a recent report that came out by Human Rights Watch, a report that I was just reading on the plane over from what's called the International Crisis Group, they all refer uniformly, they refer to the Gaza war, the war in Gaza. Israel, in order to justify the death and destruction in Gaza, it keeps saying that it was confronted in Gaza with what it calls an asymmetrical war, that it fought with Hamas terrorists. And then they say, well, yes, there might have been death and destruction, but we all know that in the course of war, a lot of things, terrible things happen. It's just the nature of war. That you have to make split-second decisions, that there's confusion in the battlefield, what they call the technical term, they refer to it as the fog of war. That everything is a little bit misty, so you don't know quite what's going on. So call it an asymmetrical war, call it the fog of war, call it, as I said earlier, the Gaza war. They all start from the assumption, the premise, that there was a war in Gaza. But was there a war in Gaza? After those 22 days, the Israelis were very proud of themselves. They went around saying, we've now shown the Arabs who's who and what's what. Because in July, August 2006, they suffered a major defeat in Lebanon. And after that defeat, they began to worry that what they call their deterrence capacity was diminished. Deterrence capacity is one of those fancy technical terms that political scientists invent in order to make you believe that they know something that you don't, and most of the time they don't. All it means is the Arab world's fear of Israel. That's the deterrence capacity. And Israel was worried that after what happened in July, August 2006 in Lebanon, that the Arabs no longer feared Israel. There was this character named Sheikh Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, and he's given to speechifying, and he was giving all these speeches, and he was going around saying, the Arabs are no longer afraid of Israel. And he was taunting the Israelis and saying, come on, attack again. If you attack again, we'll defeat you again. And this was very troubling to the Israelis. But after Gaza, they went around boasting, well, now we have shown the Arabs that we're still a fighting force. We have erased the memory of the Lebanon war because we won the war in Gaza. We won the war in Gaza. But along came an Israeli strategic analyst, and he wrote, it is very dangerous for Israel to believe it won the war when there was no war. In reality, not a single battle was fought during the 22 days. A former Israeli foreign ministry official, he said, there was no war. Hamas sat in its bunkers and came out when it was all over. So what did happen in Gaza? I noticed a few people with perplexed looks in their eyes in the audience. What did happen in Gaza? We have a fairly clear picture of what happened on the so-called battlefield. Israel began the attack with the air assault on Gaza. And by the end of the 22 days, they had launched 3,000 combat missions over Gaza. Every plane returned. None was downed. None was even harmed, damaged. That's not too surprising, because the Palestinians had no anti-aircraft weapons to speak of. After the first week, Israel launched what it called its ground and air assault. The Israeli soldiers were equipped with special night fighting equipment. Hamas couldn't even see them, let alone fight them. So what happened in Gaza? In fact, we have a pretty good picture, because after those 22 days, many Israeli soldiers publicly testified to their experience in Gaza. Here's what they had to say. Soldier, there was nothing there, ghost towns. Except for some livestock, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were really not too many events. Soldier, I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there, that whole week. Soldier, everyone was disappointed about not engaging anyone. Soldier, Usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course. Not a soul. Soldier. Go ahead, ask the other soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing, no one. Soldier. There was supposed to be a tiny resistance force upon entry, but there just wasn't any. No battles, no enemy in the field, no tangling with a foe. That's only half the story. Soldier after soldier, although they were interviewed separately, soldier after soldier says, Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. No battles, no enemy in the field, no tangling with the foe, but Israel is using insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. One soldier after another testifies. One soldier said, this was firepower such as I had never known. There were blasts all the time. The earth was constantly shaking. Another soldier said, on the ground you hear these thunderous blasts all day long. The Israelis commandeered Palestinian homes in Gaza, were firing into the horizon, but the ground underneath them was shaking. It was shaking so much they were told to leave the houses they had commandeered for fear the houses would collapse on them. So what did happen in Gaza? Actually, the Israeli soldiers came up with the most telling metaphors. One soldier said, it felt like hunting season had begun. Sometimes it reminded me of a PlayStation computer game. Another soldier said, you felt like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. You felt like a child with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. I was a kid once. I had my magnifying glass. I'm not very proud of it. Focused the rays of the sun, turned the ants into crispy critters. But I was not so delusional, I don't think, as to believe I was engaged in a war with the ants. In fact, the metaphor, a child with a magnifying glass burning up ants, was remarkably accurate. Among Israel's tools of the trade is its promiscuous use of white phosphorus. White phosphorus, it reaches a temperature of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 816 degrees centigrade. 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. As Oprah would say, try wrapping your mind around that. So what did Israel do with the white phosphorus? Human Rights Watch, the respected human rights organization, put out a report after the Gaza invasion entitled Reign of Fire. And it said, and now I'm quoting it, Israel repeatedly exploded white phosphorus munitions in the air over populated areas, killing and injuring civilians and damaging civilian structures. Israel dropped the white phosphorus in a school. It dropped the white phosphorus on a market. It dropped the white phosphorus on a humanitarian aid warehouse. It dropped the white phosphorus on 2 hospitals. It dropped white phosphorus in Al-Quds Hospital, and it dropped white phosphorus on Al-Wafa Hospital. Human Rights Watch wrote that the hospitals were clearly marked, and there does not appear to have been fighting in that immediate area. By the end of those 22 days, 1,400 Palestinians had been killed, of whom up to 4/5 were civilians. About 358 were children. 13 Israelis were killed, of whom 10 were combatants, and half of the combatants were killed due to what's called friendly fire, namely Israeli soldiers accidentally killed other Israeli soldiers. So, for every Israeli killed, 100 Palestinians were killed. For every Israeli civilian killed, about 400 Palestinian civilians were killed. That's plainly not a war. That's a massacre. After those 22 days, Israel tried hard to deflect some of the criticisms directed at it. For example, Israeli attacks damaged or destroyed 29 ambulances. Israeli attacks damaged or destroyed almost half of Gaza's 122 health facilities, including 15 hospitals. Israel said, well, what can we do? These Hamas militants, these cowards and lunatics, they were using the hospitals as refuge. But then the human rights organizations investigated the allegation after the end of the invasion. 1 human rights organization, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, really. They all investigated it separately. They all came to the same conclusion. There is no evidence that Hamas militants were hiding in the hospitals. Then Israel said Hamas was using the ambulances to ferry around ammunition, weapons, and terrorists. Human rights organizations investigated the charge. They found no evidence. In fact, Israel's own ambulatory service, it's called Magen David Adom, they themselves publicly testified, and now I'm quoting them, there was no use of Palestinian Red Crescent Society ambulances for the transport of weapons or ammunition. Even Israel's own ambulatory service said it's just not true. Nonetheless, Israel damaged or destroyed 29 ambulances. Then Israel destroyed 30 mosques and damaged 15 more. Israel said the mosques were being used to conceal weapons and were being used to launch attacks. The mission headed by Richard Goldstone, to whom I'll return, he investigated one case of what he called an intentional Israeli attack on a mosque that killed at least 15 Palestinians who were attending service. What did he conclude? He concluded, quote, "There's no evidence that this mosque was used for the storage of weapons or any military activity by Palestinian armed groups." But Israel says, okay, maybe not that mosque, but other mosques were being used to store weapons and so forth. There's still a problem because Israel targeted all the minarets on the mosques in Gaza. The minarets are too narrow, the Gaza minarets are too narrow, they don't contain staircases, and so they could not have been used by snipers or lookouts. So why did Israel target the minarets? There's a very good, very excellent South African jurist named John Dugard, and Mr. Dugard led a mission to Gaza, a fact-finding mission. He investigated this matter, and this is what he concluded. The mosques, and more particularly the minarets, had been targeted on the grounds that they symbolized Islam. They were targeted because they symbolized Islam. Well, that's a good reason. You can't quarrel with that. But we all know that it's not so simple, because you know those Hamas lunatics and cowards, they were using the Palestinians in Gaza as human shields. They were forcing the Palestinians in front of them in order to force Israel to fire on civilians. Israel had no choice, because Hamas was using the Palestinian civilians as human shields. Again, all the human rights organizations investigated the claim, the allegation. The most respected of all the human rights organizations is, of course, Amnesty International, the Nobel Peace Prize winner. Amnesty did a very exhaustive study of this human shield issue. Here's what they concluded. Contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. It just didn't happen. Even if it were true that Hamas had engaged in human shielding, even if it were true, it still could not explain the deaths in Gaza. Why? Well, here's what Amnesty had to say. The attacks that caused the greatest number of fatalities and injuries, the Palestinians, they were not caught in the crossfire of battles between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces. How did they die? Many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in their yard, hanging the laundry on the roof, when they were targeted in airstrikes or tank shelling. How did the children die? Those 358 Palestinian children. Was Hamas using them as human shields? Here's what Amnesty said. The children were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. It's not true, however, it's emphatically not true that there was no human shielding in Gaza. In fact, there was quite a lot. By Israel. Israel was using Palestinians as human shields, and that fact has been voluminously documented by human rights organizations. All the investigative bodies concluded that Israel committed multiple war crimes. As many of you know, after the Gaza invasion, the Gaza Massacre, there were many human rights investigations of what happened. The best known, probably known to everybody in this room, was one that was commissioned by the United Nations Human Rights Council. and they appointed a fellow named Richard Goldstone, a South African jurist, an eminent international prosecutor. He headed up the prosecutions in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. They named Richard Goldstone as the head of the mission. And a few months later, he produced a quite substantial report. It ran to about 500 pages, single-spaced. Its main conclusions, or the ones that should concern us here, are first, he said, that Israel launched a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population. That's his words in quotes. Israel launched a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. But maybe what happened in Gaza was because some soldiers just went berserk. It was some rotten apples in the barrel. But the Goldstone mission said, no, that's not really possible. The mission concluded, the systematic and deliberate nature of the activities leave the mission in no doubt that responsibility lies in the first place with those who designed, planned, ordered, and oversaw the operations. It was not a few rotten apples, a few soldiers who went awry. According to the Goldstone mission, it was Israel's political and military leaders who planned and oversaw the disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population. Some people criticized the Goldstone report. They said, well, these sorts of allegations, they're kind of extreme. How can he reach conclusions which are so radical? Problem was that Goldstone couldn't but reach that conclusion because this is what the Israeli leaders were saying before, during, and after the attack. It's not as if the Israelis lacked in candor. They were very honest about what they intended to do and what they did do. Before the attack, the Israeli head of the Northern Command, he said, in the next war, we will yield disproportionate power against every village from which shots are fired on Israel. We will cause immense damage and destruction. The former head of Israel's National Security Council, he said, in the next war, it will lead to intense suffering among the enemy population, the destruction of homes and infrastructure. It will lead to the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people. During the attack, Israel's foreign minister, Tzipi Livni, she said, Hamas now understands that when you fire on Israel's citizens, it responds by going wild. And that is a good thing. The day after the attack, Ms. Livni said on Channel 10 News in Israel, quote, Israel demonstrated real hooliganism during the course of the recent operation, which is what I demanded. And then a strange thing happened with Ms. Livni. She went to the United Kingdom, she got off her plane, and somebody presented her with papers that she's a war criminal. And she was shocked. She was completely shocked. Ms. Livni was bewildered. She was completely shocked. Ms. Livni was bewildered. She was perplexed because she was certain that real hooliganism, it was protected by the Geneva Conventions. After the attack, a former Israeli defense official, he said, with an armada of fighter planes attacking Gaza, Israel decided to play the role of a mad dog for the sake of future deterrence. A former senior Israeli security official, he boasted that Israel had restored its deterrence capacity. The Arabs now fear Israel. Why? He said because Israel has shown Hamas, Iran, and the region that it can be as lunatic as any of them. Lunatic, mad dog, real hooliganism, wild, immense suffering. What else could the Goldstone mission conclude except that Israel intends to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population, and that the decisions were made by the senior leaders in the military and in the political life of Israel? When the Goldstone mission report came out, as most of you know, it evoked a hysterical reaction among Israelis across the political spectrum. Not just the so-called right wing, but the doves, the ones we're told are lovers of peace. So, for example, Sir Shimon Peres, because the British knighted him, Sir Peres, the Nobel laureate for peace, he said that the Goldstone report is a mockery of history, and that Goldstone is a small man devoid of any sense of justice. The Israeli ambassador to the United States, a fellow named Michael Oren, some people think he's a historian, Mr. Oren said that the Goldstone report was even worse than Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust deniers. Back in the United States, Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, he said the Goldstone report is so filled with lies, distortions, and blood libels that it could have been drafted by Hamas extremists. He said it recalled the protocols of the elders of Zion. He said that Goldstone was an evil man, an absolute traitor. You could just imagine how indignant he would have been if he actually read the report. Now, as some of you know, every circus needs a clown, so along came Elie Wiesel. He called the report a crime against the Jewish people. And now the interesting question comes up. Why the hysterical reaction against the Goldstone report? Because the Goldstone report, as I said, was the last in a long line of reports that were issued after the Gaza Massacre. Amnesty International issued 2 reports. Human Rights Watch issued 6 reports. There were reports issued by Palestinian human rights organizations, Israeli human rights organizations. There were independent international fact-finding missions. Why the hysteria over the Goldstone report? In fact, the Goldstone report, although excellent in my opinion, was probably the most conservative, cautious, and judicious of all the reports. So why were the Israelis and their American supporters so hysterical? And the answer is not hard to find. Because Mr. Goldstone is not only Jewish, but he's a self-declared Zionist. He says, I worked for Israel all of my adult life. I fully support Israel's right to exist. I am a firm believer in the absolute right of the Jewish people to have their home there. That's Mr. Goldstone. Mr. Goldstone sits in the board of governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He received an honorary doctorate from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His mother was an activist in the Zionist movement. His daughter went to live in Israel. When Goldstone was asked, why did you go into human rights law, international law? He said it was because of the Nazi Holocaust. And so now Israel had a real problem on its hands. Because for decades, it's perfected these ideological weapons to discredit any critics of Israel and to discredit any criticism of Israel. So, if you criticize Israel, you must be an anti-Semite, or a self-hating Jew, or a Holocaust denier. But Mr. Goldstone's person and his profession now made it impossible to use those weapons any longer. He neutralized those weapons. As the Israeli columnist Gideon Levy put it, this time with Goldstone, the messenger is propaganda-proof. Mr. Goldstone, he doesn't seem like your typical anti-Semite. He doesn't act like your typical self-hating Jew. He says, I love Israel, I'm a Zionist. He doesn't seem like your typical Holocaust denier. He says it's because of the Holocaust that I went into human rights law. Well, if Mr. Goldstone is not an anti-Semite, if he's not a self-hating Jew, if he's not a Holocaust denier, if he's not incompetent or a fool, and the former chief prosecutor in the tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda doesn't seem like an incompetent or a fool, so the only plausible explanation for the devastating content of the report he authored, the only possible explanation was it was true.